This is the final session, week 12, topic 12, and the material is in test doubles and a review of the labs. There's some additional videos posted here which you might be interested in having a look at. They're a review of all the labs to date, labs 8 through 12, with a demonstration of how you can import them all into a single fresh empty Eclipse workspace, and also how you can run them. These short videos might be handy as you're preparing to work on your assignment. Some notes about the assignment submission. We're looking for you to submit this template when you submit the assignment. So I'll leave you to have a look at that in your own time. It's just a summary really of your achievements in the assignment. It's a PowerPoint file, and you'll find the PowerPoint file inside the final section of the last lab today. This is the submission template we ask you to download and fill out. Back to our talks today then. I'm going to talk about a review of all the labs. Ideally you should go through these two videos first before attempting to listen and follow along with this lab here. Then we'll be looking at some unrelated aspects, particularly unit test patterns in general and test doubles. Okay, I'm starting now with the lab review. We've been through quite a few labs now in the last few weeks, which have progressively enhanced a very simple console application through to being a REST service exporting a range of APIs or endpoints, also a REST client. And finally, in today's lab, we've converted the service, the REST server, into a Kotlin application. Lots of stuff flying around here, so I'd like to just review all of that as clearly as we can. So it's these labs here. You remember in lab 8 we developed a skeleton for the assignment 2. That was, we implemented a range of the baseline and starter features as a console application. We didn't implement any tests. Lab 9 refactored that application to expose the API as a series of endpoints. Lab 10 built a client project to interact with those websites, those endpoints. So we had a client and a server in that instance. Lab 12 implemented some unit tests in the client. So we were exercising the REST endpoints via unit test framework. And finally, this week's lab is converting the service into a Kotlin application if you choose the Kotlin route in your assignment. Let's look at each of these in turn for a moment. Before we do so, all of these projects are on GitHub at this URL, and all of the various revisions are tagged. So if you explore any of these individual repositories here, you'll be able to fast forward or rewind to any given point in the labs we've covered to date. Back to lab 8, it was a single project skeleton. I've called it lab 08 in the earlier demonstrations. Delivered a console user experience, and there was no REST, there was no distribution. It was an application running entirely on your own workstation. As I mentioned, you can proceed and look at individual revisions. If you go to the GitHub repo, these in fact are the various revisions, and you can reset the head if you're used to Git to any of these points to see what the application was like at those levels. And of course you'll recall that this version of the application implemented a baseline plus set of features. So our implementation included these, and I think we went a little bit into the baseline as well as the starter. So that got you going, and you can use that project as a basis for conceiving or thinking about how you would proceed with the assignment itself. In lab 9 we did a little bit of work on REST. That is, we refactored the skeleton to expose the API over HTTP, and we explored that API using a browser and also a REST client, restless. There are many clients like this you could use. So that was an interesting development, and we developed the application such that this was relatively straightforward. You might recall the lab used a Javelin framework, which is very lightweight, and we were able to have it up and running quite quickly. This is the zone in the assignment we're targeting here. That is, how would you take an API implemented in a standalone application and expose it over HTTP and REST. Again, these are the various iterations we went through in that lab, and if you go to GitHub you can look at any one of those iterations and have an idea of where we were at each of those points. Lab 10, we took some minor improvements to the service. We implemented a few additional endpoints, but we spent most of the lab focusing on building a console client to our service. In fact, we were able to take over much of the same code we had just by building a few adapters. So that then allowed us to run the console, log in, and interact with the service. The service, of course, running now as a REST application server hosted on our local machine. This is the series of iterations we went through in that lab. You can see you'd be able to browse any of these, as I mentioned, on GitHub if you go there directly. And again, we're interested in this case in implementing foundation for this part of your assignment. That is the console client accessing HTTP service. Lab 11, we kept going. We added one or two more additional endpoints, and the big change on the server in this instance was we deployed it to Heroku. So if you went through the lab, you will have moved the pacemaker skeleton from your own machine up onto the cloud, and you would have been then able to reconfigure your client to interact with that cloud service. It's effectively, you're no longer using localhost 7000, you're using a URL that would have been given to you during the cloud deployment process. So that was quite an interesting development, and there was various modifications made to both projects, and that would take you into the outstanding range if you were just looking at the deployment column in our metrics. This week's lab, the final lab in the series, Lab 12, is taking a brand new project called Pacemaker Skeleton Kotlin, and it's implementing the REST service in that language, in Kotlin. We would expect the same client applications to work as before. There'll be slight variation in that because we didn't implement all the endpoints, but the substantial number of the same tests will still run, and the user experience should still allow the subset of commands to operate successfully. So this was the final Kotlin project then. Went through a series of iterations to introduce the various models and then implement the API itself. We've kept the structure of the project as close as we can to Java, but hopefully you'll have seen a reasonable reduction in code size. Particularly the model classes become data classes, which Siobhan will have introduced to you, and large amounts of code reduced here. And also you'll find that the Pacemaker API and the REST service are also a little bit more elegant and simpler to reason with, provided of course you're bought into the Kotlin syntax. So this is kind of where we ended up. If you're embarking on the assignment, you probably don't need necessarily to go through all these labs again if you've done them. Your starting points could be Lab 11 for the service in Java, Lab 11 for the client in Java, and if you do want to explore Kotlin, then you have Lab 12 to possibly replace Lab 11. And we'd be quite happy, if you're going for Kotlin, to stick with the Kotlin on the server side, keep the client in Java if you like, or you could do both. But a good effort at Kotlin on the server would achieve significant rewards. Okay, hopefully that was helpful to give you a review of where we were, and we'll take a look now at some new features, XUnit patterns in general, and we'll go on to talk about test doubles.